Hi, I'm Ryan.
Hey, I'm Jess, and you're listening to Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
On today's episode, we are going to talk about oversharing or TMI in therapy, which came up because we saw a lot of comments online from some of our videos talking about, I don't want to TMI my therapist or I've said too much kind of thing.
Stay tuned. So, Ryan, when you were doing a video on lying, a lot of the responses were actually quite vulnerable, intimate, and like sharing about their experiences in therapy and why they might lie. But one of the things that came up that kind of struck both you and we actually responded to quite a bit, was this aspect of TMI, which stands for too much information. I don't want to like overload my therapist.
Right.
What is this? Why do you think people are so concerned about TMI?
Well, I mean, I guess a TMI just being kind of like an idea that lives in, friend groups and kind of like in terms of what's socially acceptable to talk about with anyone kind of. So this kind of idea of too much information, I think, can be about the quantity of information, and it is also very often going to be about the content, and the things that people consider inappropriate to talk about in, I don't know, in polite company, so to speak. Yeah,
Yeah, it can also be used to kind of shame somebody. If someone's talking about something like, whoa, TMI. So it can also be like, don't share that here, which is a sort of like social policing we can also see.
that's true. And actually, as you mentioned that, like I've been kind of the recipient of that TMI reaction before, and it is interesting to me how much of a surprise it has come as. That I mean, there are some times when I'm talking about something and I'm very mindful of who's with me because I don't, I kind of know the comfort level of different friends with different
Yeah,
topics.
of course.
And then on the other hand, people have said like, "Oh, TMI," and I'm actually not even sure what about what I said is TMI because it wasn't
Yeah.
something that I associate with any kind of discomfort. So I
Mhm.
guess like some examples that we came up together that are kind of often considered too much information might be sharing like a lot of details of a story, what you call the gritty bits.
Yeah, this actually comes up in my office so often, where someone almost thinks giving me the full story, the play by play, is almost boring to me, or they need to cut to the chase. And it's incredible how like all these gritty bits or like kind of like the nuance of something can feel really shameful because it's like you're
Mm.
taking up too much space, you're taking up too much of my time in the therapy room.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think we experiences that pretty differently as therapists, and we're going to get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
I think one of the places in the past I've heard it come up most often is around sex. I've often had the question from a client who maybe starts sharing a story or sharing a concern and says like, "Is this okay to talk about here?"
Mm,
Or, "Are you okay with this?"
mm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So there can be a lot of, shame and social expectations around talking about sex. It's something that many people in Western culture, and it varies by country as well. I'm thinking like the UK, where we both trained, like you really don't talk about sex in public. That's not socially acceptable. So there are a lot of requirements around how this is discussed.
And one thing that we're going to be talking about in a later episode is on men. Funnily enough, I find it's often my male clients that might feel uncomfortable talking about sex. And not just because I am a cis female therapist, it's also just not necessarily done. And I want to dive into that more in that later episode. But it is an example of like, we're not always cultured, even within our friend groups or in our social circles, to be able to talk about a very intimate part of our life.
That's a really good point. Yeah. I think I've got like maybe a glimpse into some of that as a queer person. I have people that I would kind of more or less describe as a gal pal. And in a lot of those contexts, like some talking about sex, talking about some experiences we've had recently or in the past is relatively normal with a certain group of gal pals.
Mhm. Yeah.
Whereas the cis men that I know, especially if it's in a group of all cis men and me, that sex is kind of off the table, and I
Yeah.
think it's one of the costs maybe of toxic masculinity
Yeah.
is that there's no one that men feel safe to talk about sex with because there's so much about performance that is laid on top of that, like what it means to be a good enough or a sexual enough man or a big enough man.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, so I'm excited to talk about that in an episode as well.
One of the other things that can be really tricky are some of the things that we might be really ashamed about in our body. And I'm not thinking just about body dysmorphia that can come in, but I'm actually talking about the taboo, like our bodily fluids, our bodily functions, how we might feel let down by our body in certain instances. And I've noticed that there can be a real shame in being able to just talk about the reality that we're facing in our bodies.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's something that comes up a lot as well, where that can be the TMI thing, could be about something with the bathroom, or just kind of basic bodily functions and the shame that can come with that. If you, at least when I kind of reflect on the way Western folks are conditioned from early on, is that like you don't talk about that. There's only certain words that you're allowed to use about that. There's just inherently a lot of shame around the bathroom
Yeah.
and bodily things that are out of our control. I even think about the way kind of our culture is around passing gas or belching, that like, our bodies all do these things and they really have to sometimes. So it's interesting that we have developed such a culture around suppressing them.
Yeah. Oh, that was a good one, Ryan. I often have to tell clients you're allowed to not mute yourself when you are like blowing your nose in session because you're crying.
Mm.
I'm okay with that. Like it's not that big a deal for me to hear your sniffles or your sneezes or like having to blow your nose because we've actually had a really emotional moment.
Yeah, nose blowing is a really interesting one. I'm just there's an example of a time when I was like kind of told that my body was TMI as a teenager. So I blow my nose really loud. There's just a piece of information that everyone can have,
Are you a bit
and
of a honker? Are you
I'm a bit of a honker, though I've never been called that.
good
I
to
was
know?
in high school French class, and I used to always, because I knew that I blew my nose, quote, too loud for society. So I
Yep.
would step out into the hall when I was sick to blow my nose. This was back in the day when we all went and did everything anyways when we were sick. So
Mhm.
there I am sick at school with a cold and went blew my nose in the hall. And I came back in and my French teacher said, Bonjour, Monsieur l'Elephant. Hello, Mr. Elephant. And I was just, yeah, didn't blow my nose again for a while.
I'm trying to be
Yeah,
I'm trying to be so empathic. That is so funny.
it's a hilarious moment. Yeah, no, you're right to laugh. It is really funny. It was very shaming in the moment, but I mean, I share the story because I have levity around it now. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I think that like one thing that we said to almost all the comments that talked about TMI. Oh my gosh, I love when you share everything. I don't think there is such a thing as TMI in my office. We were talking about this last episode about how sometimes I have to almost like catch myself to remember that for someone else, maybe this question is TMI because I'm so comfortable in the space. And the next question that seems legitimate to me might not actually be something that has been asked before. But for me, when a client says that, I do everything in my power to make the space safe for them. And I think it's the same for you too.
absolutely, absolutely. That's I was surprised at first to see comments coming in about TMI because like if something's TMI for your therapist, who is it not TMI for? Like at that point, like how much do we have to withhold of ourselves just forever from everyone?
Yeah.
And I don't, that actually sounds like carrying a pretty big burden in isolation, depending on what the subject is. Like some of it, we're giggling about because it's just like, but with the shame that can come with some of these, or if someone's had experiences that were really harmful to them around a quote taboo topic, and just have to keep that quiet and keep re-experiencing that shame, that that feels like something to bring to therapy.
And I'm thinking about the fact that you and I laugh about like you blowing your nose, but actually that comment that is now funny, it stopped a behavior of yours. It allowed you to realize that you will be ridiculed for just allowing your body to be normal. And so these comments are what I call like the social policing. They're the ways in which we learn to make ourselves small enough to fit into the social box, so to speak. And
Right.
for me, as you perfectly said, therapy should be the place where you can let those go, that the outside expectations and rules and modalities or motifs can kind of stay outside. And for me, it's the gritty of a story. So I had
Mhm.
Denise, our producer, had asked me to do a post on um, a funny post on sharing, and I thought, oh, I'll do the one on how much I love when someone shares and reads a text conversation to me. And because for me, it's the gritty of a story. It's that aspect of sharing it all. When a client brings a topic to me, and you can pick anything you want, let's pick shy, that they're really shy in the workplace and they don't always want to raise their voice. If you're giving me a play by play of a situation, what you're actually giving me is you're teleporting me to that experience with you. And you're actually showing rather than just trying to like cerebrally talk about how this is impacting you. And I can see how small you felt in the meeting. And I can see how you had something to say, but the conversation went too fast. I can see what that would do bodily. And intuitively, then I can meet you much more empathically than I can meet you just talking about this concept, divorced from any kind of situation. And it's kind of the exact same with a text message. You can tell me that you had a fight with your friend or someone else, but reading it, I can see what you said. I can see how they responded. I actually now can see this interpersonal connection that allows me a depth of understanding. So it's not just that I want to see receipts, it's actually that I want to have an insight into what language did you use? What happens when you're angry? Where do we go when we're angry? How are we typing this? The other one is, how do you read this to me? How might in my head, I'm like, oh, could we reinterpret this to how it could be received? And like
Mhm.
we could do some of that really cool back and like forth work because you're bringing me into a situation in your world.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I do think about with that too, just like I think a lot when clients want to share text with me about the parts that they might want to skip because it might paint it
Mhm.
in a different light in the way that they would like to experience it themselves or be viewed by me or anyone else. And I notice that in myself too. When I'm reading a text to someone, I might kind of like skim past a part, or want to like just read the phrase that really impacted me in the conversation or something.
Yeah.
Um, which doesn't necessarily let me fully process the reality of what may have occurred. I just view it as kind of my attempt to control the narrative, without integrating every part of it.
Well, absolutely. When I'm giving like any kind of advice or help on an argument, it's to talk about sometimes the example can get the like can be the thing that we focus on when it's
Mhm.
actually like the larger thing. So how do we navigate that? And in an exchange where you're skipping, you might skip all the things that are actually talking about the pleasant parts.
Mm.
And Denise, our producer, is going to love this. All of that is, Denise, wait for it, the grist for the mill.
Dun dun
Dun,
dun.
dun, dun. It's
Denise rightly clocked a while back how often we use that phrase, so it's on our therapist is not okay bingo card.
often, but it's so true, Denise. It's one of those things that if we get to see all these things, we get such an insight into who you are, into what you might share, into what you might hold on to, which is might be actually what you're bringing. And all of that feels so important within that
Mhm.
extra of quote unquote oversharing.
Mhm. Mhm. The thing that ends up being, I think, potentially really meaningful in therapy is those parts that we omit when we talk about it, whether it's in a text exchange or even moreover, something that we don't want to say to anyone else or maybe admit out loud because we ourselves will hear us say it
Mhm.
about how we feel about a situation or about, a particular instance that was really felt shameful to us.
Hmm.
About, maybe I had an accident with a bodily function, or maybe I had a sexual experience that felt really scary or really rejecting, or that I feel like, I wish I had avoided that for whatever reason. But saying those parts out loud can, one, help ease the burden of the shame that comes with them, and two, allow us to fully process a situation that might be stuck, might be kind of frozen at that moment of the thing that we don't want to say, that we don't want to address.
Hmm.
That's not going anywhere if we just leave it frozen out of fear. So when you're ready, it's not TMI. It's important.
Yeah, exactly. And being able to kind of recognize when you're holding that back, don't shame that. That's information for you. When you're holding something back in therapy, just embrace that part of you, even if it's silently, to be like, oh, I'm not ready yet. Or there's something that I want to say, let's say to Ryan, but I don't quite know how yet. I
Mm.
think often we want to shame the parts of ourselves that either aren't ready or that are kind of conditioned not to. And when we do that, we actually not only silence that part further, but we then shame ourselves on top of that.
I've just had what I would say is a stroke of genius.
Go
I
on.
decided TMI, we could rewrite that acronym to this might be important.
Ooh.
Exciting, isn't it? This might be important.
I had to do the
Um,
mental gymnastics to make sure that worked. But yeah, it does.
yeah, we could put a little lowercase b in there that kind of hides, TMBI. Yeah, that because where there is that shame, something important is happening. That's
Mm.
that's kind of my sincere feeling about that.
I think that's really awesome that you're talking about that and thinking about that and thinking about what we were kind of talking about before with some of these categories. Let's
Mhm.
talk about sex, baby. Let's make it a topic that we actually address.
Let's talk about sex and
Um,
bodies.
and bodies. I think one of the things that we were kind of just flagging above is that sex can be something that we don't want to talk about with our therapist. We're about to dive into this. So, any listener, if this is something you don't really feel comfortable with, just skip ahead probably about 5 minutes and we'll be done. I promise you. But if you're interested in like what we think about this, keep listening. That often what we desire in bed, who we desire to bring to bed, what our fantasies are about that, how we feel as a sexual partner. For me, sometimes it's my knowledge of a certain thing, or more importantly, my lack of knowledge. We don't always know all the ins and outs of certain things. And being able to bring that up in a space where we can actually be together in that and talk about that is so important because it actually says a lot about us. It's such an intimate and vulnerable part of us that for many people, not all, makes up a huge part of our self and our identity.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that people spend a lot of time thinking about and sometimes spend a lot of time doing or trying to do, but it comes with really big, vulnerable feelings. Um, like I was kind of referencing earlier, like it comes with these thoughts and feelings around being adequate, performing well,
Yep.
um, being desirable. Um, and it can also come with these ideas about like being bad or
Yep.
dirty or inappropriate that, sometimes people get a lot of insults, especially women get a lot of insults hurled to them for desiring sex,
Yep.
something that the vast majority of the human race desires.
Oh, for sure. We do put it in its own categories. We create an age where you're allowed to think about sex. We create a particular way you're allowed to talk about it. As you and I were
Mhm.
saying with men, we might shame even bringing up that topic. But what that does is it silences a topic that for many of us we either desire or are engaging in. And it can be a huge level of self-worth to want to pleasure a partner and maybe not knowing how exactly and not knowing where to go to look into that or to feel like we're not a good enough um, lover. All of these things are therapeutic work that we can talk about. And when you feel like that's not a topic you can bring to me, you are limiting what you can grow in. And so
Yeah.
for me, the first point of call is let's embrace this topic. Let's allow it to be safe. And like anything I say is like, if we're shaming it, we're not going anywhere. Let's actually talk about it and allow it to be something that not only do we acknowledge, but we actually start to dive into, like we would with anything you're bringing to therapy.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think, having the whole episode about sex would be really exciting for me. I think that'd be a really cool topic for us to handle. It is something that I think clients and therapists can easily struggle with. Yeah. Whether it's knowing how to talk about it, maybe you're a therapist that's nervous about the topic of sex.
Mhm.
That definitely is a reality that occurs for some. Um, so yeah, I think that'd be a really cool one to tackle further.
Let's dive into that. Yeah, and give it the space it needs.
Mhm. We've also talked a little bit about bodies.
Yeah.
There can be a lot of kind of taboo or cultural TMI around bodies. Now we've talked some about this, about bodily functions and what they do. Um, but really, in a lot of ways, sometimes even just having a body feels like it's taboo. And
Mm,
referencing it directly,
yeah.
taking up space in certain ways can be viewed as taboo.
With body image, it can also be things like having cellulite, having stretch marks, being bigger. You and I do a whole kind of video series on bodies during the season of Pride and
Yep.
what bodies are acceptable, what aren't. For sure, that's a big part. And sometimes that can be the most comfortable to bring into therapy. But for me, one of the things I often work with is after pregnancy, what are our
Hmm.
bodies doing? Often bladder control is a huge thing, which can be really awkward to tell your friends, I don't want to go to coffee. And it's not because I don't want to go to coffee, it's that getting there could be quite difficult for my body. In terms of like embarrassing myself or not having a bathroom close enough. Like those are really important things to bring up about what is my body doing? How is it betraying me right now?
Absolutely, yeah. I have enough moms in my life that have given birth to know like some of the stories that they've told me about what happens while they're pregnant or after they've given birth. To know that there are like a lot of things that are not talked about in general society about the impact on your body of growing and then giving birth to a, a tiny human.
That then
Yeah.
still requires a lot of your body.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that postnatal aspect as well about what your body's expected to do, what your body then ends up actually doing, because it's not the same for every person that gives birth. Like some people struggle to breastfeed, some people don't. Some people aren't able to because of medication or all kinds of different reasons.
Absolutely.
Um, and these are things that in many cases people don't feel they can talk to everyone about.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost like I've had friends that recently gave birth kind of joke that like there's a secret society of pregnant women that once you've given birth, they like those people in your life might reach out and be like, "Hey, did this happen to you?" But
That is
it's interesting that it
exactly
feels
right.
like, yeah, it has to be like hidden behind a curtain that like this is where we keep the pregnant women that talk about, what's happened to their vulva after they've given birth.
I think that part of secrecy ties in exactly to what we're talking about, the social, of like, before you've experienced this with me, you don't get to know this about me. And that can be really tricky. Um, there's not uncommon to have a bit of annoyance, anger towards not being told this sooner, to not being prepared. And I think it's because unless you've gone through it with me, you won't get it. And that can be really tricky because it also adds to the silence.
Right. And as we're saying that, I'm thinking, there's almost kind of another face here to this TMI Two, about kind of, I mean, it's giving panopticon, right? We monitor ourselves. I almost said that earlier when you were talking about the kind of the social order. Um,
Ryan, you know I'm talking about Foucault.
I know you
I
are.
just I just didn't want to be such a nerd on a
I
podcast.
just think it's really fun to say it's giving panopticon.
I know, but like that also is a geeky thing to say. We're trying to be really accessible here.
Well,
I know it's
that's
not called
okay.
social policing, but that's what I'm going to call it because it feels more normal.
I'm fine with that. Yeah, I just thought it's funny to say it's giving panopticon. We can skip right
It
over.
is giving panopticon. You should explain what that means.
I am going to, yeah. Which is it's just this bit of social theory from Foucault who talks about how if we think people are watching, we will end up watching ourselves, even when no one's watching. And it's a theoretical prison that he does this. And I'm not going to delve a ton into that example, but it just means this kind of self-monitoring or social policing that Jess called it earlier that forces us to be silent on our own. No one needs to say TMI, we're saying it to ourselves. But the
Yes.
other maybe kind of face of that panopticon is also wanting to feel safe when you share that, wanting to kind of cultivate experiences in which you're understood. So, like, maybe I don't want to stare blankly at so and so who I know will be uncomfortable and unreceptive when I tell them about how using the bathroom changed for me after having a kid.
Mhm.
So there can be some wisdom to that too about like, I'm not gonna choose the first person to come out to as my conservative pastor
Yeah.
because I want the experience to be good,
Yeah.
not because I think my being queer is TMI. I don't have a pastor, so that was a weird example.
It was actually a great one in sense of like, yeah, we have to choose safety. We
Yeah.
have to choose like if we're going to share this, we have to allow it to be somebody that can hold us in it. And the panopticon's a great example, actually, Ryan, because it kind of means that we've fettered ourselves in chains rather than having someone else chain us. And by doing so, we kind of walk around with a lot that we hold on to, that maybe we don't even allow ourselves time to think. Therapy is the place to be able to explore that if you have a therapist you feel comfortable with. And here's why. When we don't allow a thought to be something that we share with others, when we maybe even shame it, we don't actually get to explore it. It
Hmm.
stays in the shadows. And what happens then is that it doesn't get to actually be something that we grapple with as we're constantly trying to shove it away or shove it in the corner behind a door. That can actually really hinder us because it becomes a bit more of a nightmare monster. It becomes a monster that becomes maybe bigger than it has to be. When we're
Hmm.
in therapy and we start to kind of have a back and forth, we then can understand where's the root of this coming from? Where is my shame? How might I silence myself in front of others? And then we get to have more of an understanding, a self-awareness, and then actually get to grapple with it in a safe
Mm.
space.
Absolutely. I've done some work kind of around the idea of monstrosity, was part of my doctorate. And just to briefly kind of say, like, I've actually really worked a lot with that kind of example of when you're alone in a room and you feel like something's watching you or something's behind you.
Hmm.
Lots of different theoretical explanations or cultural explanations that people might have for that. But that example of being afraid to turn around and look, and the longer you wait to look, the more real it starts to feel, and the bigger that monster becomes. So
Yeah.
metaphorically in therapy, I often talk to clients about like, should we turn around and just take a good look? Take a good long hard stare at this monster.
Oh, yeah. I often say, is this something you'd like us to shine a flashlight on or like turn the
Hmm.
lights on to? That way it's not in the shadows anymore, but maybe it's a bit smaller than we actually think.
Right.
Um, I like that idea because it can feel as we slowly but surely kind of put it away into the darkness behind us, it almost becomes something that really like kind of creates a silence around us and then can build up an identity marker that we don't share this. This is if only if someone knew this, they wouldn't want to know me. And it becomes
Mhm.
this thing that can actually be really binding to imposter complex or how much we open up to our loved ones, all of those things. This can be literally the one place that you get to start to navigate that. So it doesn't necessarily hide from those you love. Maybe you learn language to get to talk about whatever you want to bring up. Or maybe it's something where you find strategies that are, this is your safe space to do it. So it becomes less unsafe everywhere else.
I love that idea you used kind of like we're putting the chains on ourselves with that sometimes. Because I've worked with many people and I've experienced myself like how it can be to kind of hold yourself back,
Mm,
silence yourself, and that really perpetuates whatever you're struggling with. It can't change if you're not even willing to let it be in the light of the day.
yeah.
There were a couple other examples you had of kind of quote TMI or shamed body things. Do you want to share those?
Yeah, I think we've really navigated those. I think for women, there's often blood.
Mhm.
Our time of the month can be really tricky. I think with a
Yeah.
lot of clients, I've done some really great work with IBS of being able to have bathroom time be like a lovely time. Um,
Mm,
and being able to like sit with ourselves and have it be a space in the mornings that we allow our bodies to be with. And then it becomes something that is just part of our day. And
mm.
allowing that language for it to not be anything disgusting, but actually just, yeah, this is what I do in my mornings. I need a couple hours. Um, can be really special to like allow these things to be less monstrous, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. One thing that I don't like about the kind of TMI or shame culture around some of these things, especially with the example of bleeding in the time of the month, is it makes a society really stupid. I am often disgusted by how little most men know about periods.
Yeah.
It's actually like kind of shocking.
Mm,
It's like half or more than half of the world has this experience that you just are or wish to be totally blind to. And that
mm.
to me, I'm like, so TMI is not really serving our interests as people in that case.
You know what I realized about the term TMI as we're doing this is that when we first thought about doing it, it was just to respond to people and think about like how we can be open. The more we're diving into this, the more political I'm seeing it. And
Mm,
TMI is such a cute little acronym. But then what we're really doing is lashing out at somebody for wanting to share. That's actually way deeper than the term actually allows us to even think about. That TMI, as we've been doing this podcast, I've realized there's so much shame around this. That is basically the binding tether of TMI, that we can often feel like we have to hide parts of ourselves and that people won't love this part of us. That we get socially shamed if we do it from others. And I'm starting to realize like such a quiet little term actually has a lot of power. So I'm actually really glad we got to do this podcast to be able to realize like when we unpack some of these things, we realize actually how detrimental this can be.
absolutely, yeah. That's a really cool connection that you're drawing there. Really appreciate that. So many of the things that are TMI are really about people who have been marginalized.
Yeah.
It's about social things that we don't want to talk about because they make us uncomfortable, which might be
Yeah.
around racism. A
Hmm.
lot of our examples are around women,
Yeah.
queerness,
Yeah.
illness with bodies,
Sex. Yeah.
sex. These are all things that are politically kept in the dark pretty often. It's really cool that you're recognizing that. Yet another way that your therapist is not apolitical.
Yeah, go back to that episode and listen.
That was a good one, guys. That was a good one. So thanks for listening and tuning in today. It's actually become such a bigger topic than, like Jess said, than we first anticipated. It would
Hmm.
be. I do have sometimes this reaction when like I see comments or questions and I'm like, no, moving on. No such thing as TMI. But there is depth and complexity, and it's so fun how that gets to kind of come out in our discussions.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions, and a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.